I had the perfect family, and I still ruined it. One kiss led to 5 months of lies. My husband looked me in the eye and didn't recognize the woman standing in front of him. And honestly, neither did I. This is the story of how I lost everything, and why I might deserve it. The house was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the bustling chaos that used to fill the rooms just a few years ago. For years, she had lived with a constant gnawing feeling of discontent, unsure of where it had stemmed from. Was it the weight of unspoken words? Or the gradual drift between her and her husband? Maybe it was both. She had convinced herself that everything was fine, despite the growing distance between them. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. Her husband, Jack, was everything anyone could want. He was kind, attentive, and always there when she needed him. He'd been her high school sweetheart, the one she had promised to spend forever with. And yet, she found herself distancing from him. What had started as small moments of neglect soon grew into something much bigger. She wasn't interested in the affection he showered her with, and she couldn't help but feel detached when he looked at her with love in his eyes. She told herself it was nothing, perhaps just a phase, but the phase never seemed to end. As the days passed, the feelings of guilt started to creep in. It was impossible to ignore them, no matter how much she tried. She would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the weight of her own actions. Every time Jack would reach for her, she felt a sickening sense of guilt. She had taken him for granted, ignored his needs, and failed to see the depths of his affection. She thought about the years they had spent together, the children growing up under the same roof, the shared moments of laughter and tears. And yet, she was still lost. The affair had started innocently enough. A new colleague, tall, charming, and younger, began paying her attention. At first, she dismissed it. He was just being friendly, she told herself. But soon, the casual conversations turned into something more, flirting, texts, stolen glances. And before she knew it, she found herself drawn to him in ways she hadn't felt in years. It was an emotional affair at first, one where she told herself she wasn't doing anything wrong. She justified her actions by convincing herself that she wasn't truly cheating, that it was just harmless fun. But she knew, deep down, that it was more than that. As the affair grew deeper, so did the guilt. She couldn't escape it. Her family, her children, her husband, all of them had no idea what was happening. The guilt was suffocating, yet the need for the validation she was receiving from the affair partner kept her going. But when Jack confronted her, when he noticed the change in her, when he felt the coldness in her touch, everything came crashing down. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about the realization that she had betrayed the very person who had stood by her side for so many years. She had broken something that couldn't be fixed with a simple apology. In the silence of the night, she would reflect on the damage she had caused, not just to her marriage, but to herself. The guilt was unbearable. How could she have been so selfish? How could she have been so blind to everything that truly mattered? The affair had ended, but the damage was done. And as she sat there, alone, in the quiet house, she realized that the journey to healing would be long, perhaps even impossible. The emotional turmoil she had caused wasn't something that could be undone with a few heartfelt words. No, it was something much deeper than that. But could she ever truly make amends? Was it even possible to repair the shattered relationships, the broken trust? She didn't have the answers, but one thing was certain, this was just the beginning of a much longer struggle. And as she thought about all of this, she couldn't help but wonder, could she ever truly forgive herself for what she'd done? The morning had begun like any other, with the sun casting a soft glow through the bedroom window. Yet for Emily, this morning was different. The silence in the house felt suffocating, a stark contrast to the bustling life she once had. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror, her reflection staring back at her with eyes that seemed foreign. The woman in the mirror was no longer the vibrant, carefree person she had once been. Instead, there was a weight in her gaze, a weight of guilt that she couldn't shake. The affair had started innocently enough. A few passing glances, casual compliments at work. At first, she brushed them off, convincing herself that it was just harmless flirtation. After all, What harm could a little attention do? But soon, those glances turned into stolen moments, and the compliments deepened into more personal conversations. She had found herself confiding in him, something she hadn't done with her husband, Jack, in years. They had a connection, a spark that she hadn't felt in so long. But that connection came at a price. The emotional distance between Emily and Jack had grown over the years, like a slow-moving river eroding a cliffside. Jack, her high school sweetheart, was a man who had always been there for her. He had supported her through thick and thin, loved her without reservation, and stood by her side as they built a life together. But somewhere along the way, she had begun to take him for granted. As their relationship faded into routine, Emily found herself drifting. She no longer saw the man she had married in Jack's eyes. She saw someone else, someone who didn't meet her needs, someone who no longer excited her. The once passionate relationship had dulled, leaving behind a quiet, nagging sense of dissatisfaction. In the beginning, she tried to ignore it, blaming stress, the responsibilities of raising children, and the monotony of everyday life. But deep inside, she knew the truth: she wasn't in love with Jack anymore. That's when the affair partner, Alex, entered the picture. He was different, younger, more spontaneous. His energy was infectious, and for the first time in years, Emily felt alive again. She tried to convince herself that she was only seeking a bit of excitement, a little spark to reignite the fire that had long burned out. But the more she spent time with Alex, the more emotionally entangled she became. What had started as innocent flirtation quickly grew into something deeper, something more dangerous. Their conversation started with harmless exchanges about work, the weather, and small talk about life. But every word he said to her seemed to dig into a part of her that had been dormant for so long. Alex made her feel seen in a way that Jack hadn't. She found herself hanging on every word he spoke, relishing in the attention he gave her. What had been a fleeting distraction grew into something she hadn't expected. She hadn't intended for it to become this serious, but she was addicted to the validation. As the affair progressed, Emily started pulling away from Jack. Every time he tried to engage her, emotionally or physically, she felt a creeping sense of resentment. It wasn't that she didn't love him anymore, it was more that she felt stifled by his unwavering affection. He still saw her as the young woman he fell in love with, the woman who shared his dreams and his life, but she didn't see herself that way anymore. Emily began rationalizing her actions. She told herself that Jack wasn't interested in her, that he was too busy with his work, too focused on their kids, and never seemed to notice how lonely she felt. She justified her secret meetings with Alex as a way to fill the void that had slowly grown in her marriage. And it was true. Alex listened when she spoke, he made her laugh, and he looked at her with the kind of admiration she hadn't felt in years. It was intoxicating, this feeling of being desired, and she told herself it wasn't a big deal. The lies started to build up, first small ones. She told Jack that she was working late when she was actually meeting Alex at a cafe, stealing quiet moments in corners of the city where they could talk without fear of being overheard. Their conversations turned deeper, their touch became more intimate, and with every secret encounter, Emily's guilt grew. But so did her emotional attachment to Alex. The more she pushed Jack away, the more she pulled Alex closer. Her internal conflict became unbearable. There were moments, brief but powerful, when Emily considered ending the affair. She would look at Jack, who was always there, steady and dependable, and feel a pang of guilt in her chest. But then Alex would text her, and that feeling of being needed, of being wanted, would take over. The cycle continued. Emily knew what she was doing was wrong, but at the time, it didn't feel like enough to stop. She justified it with thoughts of how distant she had felt in her marriage, how much Jack had changed, how they were no longer the same people they once were. Her heart knew better, but she refused to acknowledge it. She told herself it was just a phase, that she would stop before things got too serious. But each time she saw Alex, each time their hands brushed where their lips met, she felt a rush of exhilaration that she hadn't felt in years. She convinced herself that it wasn't an affair, that it was something less serious, something that wouldn't hurt anyone. The more she justified it, the harder it became to deny the truth. Emily was emotionally entangled in a way she never expected. She couldn't remember the last time she had truly felt connected to Jack, but with Alex, the connection was undeniable. It was the kind of connection she had been yearning for, the kind that made her feel alive. But nothing lasts forever, and the affair was no exception. The lies began to unravel, and the truth came crashing down. The emotional affair that Emily had convinced herself was harmless had become something much darker. What she had thought was a temporary escape was now a devastating betrayal that she would have to face. As Emily stood in front of the mirror, the weight of her actions bore down on her, and she knew there was no going back. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The affair had changed everything, but the question remained, could she ever fix what she had broken? Could the love she once shared with Jack ever be rekindled, or was the damage irreparable? These were the questions she would have to face in the coming days, as she tried to navigate the mess she had created, both for herself and for her family. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. She wiped the tears from her eyes and quickly turned away from the mirror, trying to steady her breath. She wasn't ready to face the consequences, but there was no escaping them now. The affair was over, but its impact was just beginning. The emotional toll of her actions would follow her for the rest of her life, and she had no idea how to begin making things right. As she walked toward the door, a sense of dread settled in her chest. She wasn't sure where this journey would take her, but one thing was certain, she would never be the same again. And with that, Emily braced herself for the inevitable fallout that was about to come. The affair had changed everything. Emily could feel it in the very fabric of her existence. The betrayal was no longer a secret she could hide. It had begun innocently, a stolen kiss here, a whispered conversation there, but soon it grew into something much deeper. And now, the consequences of her actions were beginning to surface, affecting everyone in ways she hadn't imagined. Her heart pounded as she thought about Jack, the man who had given her everything. His eyes, once filled with warmth and admiration, now burned with betrayal. The man who had been her best friend, her high school sweetheart, had become a stranger. When he discovered the affair, the anger in his voice was so raw, it felt like it ripped through her very soul. He had been blindsided, unaware that his wife, the woman he had loved for so long, had been giving her heart to someone else. His disbelief was palpable, his heartbreak uncontainable. But what hurt even more was the pain that flashed across his face when he realized that the emotional intimacy he had sought for so long had been given to someone else. She had tried to explain herself, tried to justify her actions, but nothing she said could undo the damage. He didn't want her explanations, nor did he want her apologies. His pain was too deep, and the trust that had been the cornerstone of their relationship was shattered beyond repair. Emily could see it in his eyes, he was done. It wasn't just her infidelity that tore them apart, it was the fact that she had taken him for granted. She had chosen to bury herself in the attention of another man instead of facing the issues with Jack, issues they could have resolved together if only she had been honest. She had allowed herself to believe that she was entitled to more, forgetting that love was about commitment, not escape. Her children, too, had suffered. They had always seen their parents as a united front, their love a symbol of stability and security. But now, that image had been shattered. The trust they had in their mother was gone. Her daughter, Lily, had asked her with innocent confusion why Mommy and Daddy weren't together anymore, her small face etched with hurt. "Did we do something wrong, Mommy?" Lily had asked, and Emily could feel the weight of her guilt growing heavier. No child should have to witness the unraveling of their parents' marriage, especially not at the cost of a selfish choice. Her sons, Ethan and Max, had taken it differently, acting out in their own ways. They weren't old enough to understand the complexities of relationships, but they could sense the tension, the anger in their father's voice, and the sorrow in their mother's. They withdrew into themselves, avoiding eye contact, retreating into their games or their rooms. But the pain wasn't just emotional. There was a physical toll that Emily hadn't anticipated. The day Jack had discovered her betrayal, everything seemed to shift. He had confronted her, the anger radiating off of him like a furnace. His fists clenched, his whole body trembling with rage. The conversation had escalated into a shouting match, with accusations and pain spilling from both of them. Emily had never seen Jack like this before, angry, hurt, and unable to process the weight of what had happened. And then, as if in a blind fury, he had charged at Alex, the affair partner. He hadn't even thought, hadn't planned it, it was instinct, driven by raw emotion. The confrontation had happened so quickly that Emily hadn't been able to stop it. Her ex-husband, a man who had always been composed, had thrown a punch, knocking Alex to the ground. In a panic, Emily screamed, rushing toward them, trying to break them apart. The scene was chaotic, violent in a way she hadn't known was possible. The sound of the punch, the desperate cries from Alex, and Jack's gruff voice shouting at him to leave, it was all too much. The emotional toll of her actions had now manifested physically, and the damage was profound. She had wanted to undo everything she had done, but there was no going back. The fight between Jack and Alex had torn apart the fragile remnants of their relationship. The aftermath of the affair left Emily reeling. She felt an overwhelming sense of guilt that consumed her every waking moment. She had done this to her family, and now she had to face the fallout. She had broken the hearts of those who had trusted her the most. Jack didn't want to speak to her. Her children didn't look at her the same way. They saw her not as the loving mother they once knew, but as the woman who had betrayed their father, the woman who had broken their family. She couldn't hide from it anymore, her choices had consequences, and now she was forced to live with them. The hardest part was the realization of how much damage she had caused. The affair had been about her own dissatisfaction, her own need for excitement and validation. But the destruction it had left in its wake was far worse than she had ever imagined. Jack was heartbroken, her children were confused, and the family they had built together had been fractured. Emily had no idea how to start fixing it, or even if she could. Every apology seemed hollow, every attempt to explain herself felt like an excuse. How could she make them understand? How could she make them believe that she was truly sorry? It wasn't just about repairing the relationships, it was about rebuilding the trust that had been shattered. And that would take time, time she wasn't sure she had. Her guilt was overwhelming. She couldn't look at her children without seeing the pain in their eyes, and she couldn't look at Jack without feeling like a stranger in her own home. The weight of her betrayal had sunk in, and she realized that no matter how much she wished to take it back, it was too late. She had changed their lives forever. The affair was over, but its impact would linger long after the last word had been spoken, long after the last tear had been shed. As Emily stood there, staring at the broken pieces of her life, she knew one thing for sure: the emotional fallout from the affair would be with her forever. She had made her choices, and now she had to face the consequences. The road to redemption would be long and uncertain, and she wasn't sure she would ever be able to fix the damage she had caused. But the first step was confronting the truth, something she had been avoiding for far too long. It wasn't going to be easy, but if there was any hope of salvaging what was left of her family, it had to start with her. The fallout from her actions was far from over, but Emily was determined to face it head-on. She had to find a way to rebuild the relationships she had shattered, with her husband, her children, and herself. But first, she had to heal. Only then would she be able to move forward, and perhaps, one day, find a way to forgive herself. The days after Emily's confession were some of the darkest of her life. She had never imagined the weight of the consequences that would follow her actions. She thought the affair would be her escape, a fleeting moment of desire that she could bury deep down and forget. But now, every passing day felt like an eternity, each second dragging her deeper into a pit of regret and sorrow. Her first attempt at reconciliation was with Jack. She had hoped that with time, he would begin to see past the betrayal, that he would be able to forgive her. But the harsh reality was that the damage had been done. The trust that they had built over the years had been shattered beyond repair. She had been selfish, and no amount of apologizing could undo the harm she had caused. Jack's eyes, once filled with love, were now cold and distant. Every word he spoke to her felt like a reminder of how far they had drifted apart. She tried to talk to him, to explain herself, but the words felt empty. She begged him to understand, to remember the years of love they had shared, but he wouldn't listen. "You don't get it, Emily. You took something that was sacred," he said, his voice breaking. I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me? The pain in his words was too much for her to bear. She had destroyed him, and she knew it. His anger and hurt were impossible to ignore, and the guilt weighed on her like a heavy stone. She had never seen Jack like this before, so broken, so distant. It was as if the man she once knew had disappeared entirely, leaving behind a shell of resentment and hurt. Her children's reactions were just as devastating. Lily, her eldest daughter, had always been the sensitive one, and the sight of her mother in such a broken state was too much for her to handle. She had always looked up to Emily as a figure of strength and love, but now her mother seemed like a stranger. "Why did you do it, Mom? Why did you hurt Dad like that?" Lily asked through tears. Emily didn't have an answer. How could she explain something so inexplicable, so selfish? Her sons, Ethan and Max, were older, and they seemed to process things differently. Ethan, at 18, was distant, avoiding eye contact and withdrawing into his room, while Max, 16, was angry, snapping at his mother whenever she tried to speak to him. They had lost their trust in her, and no matter how many times she tried to explain, they couldn't seem to hear her. Emily had never felt more alone in her life. She was a stranger to her own children, and that hurt more than anything else. But it wasn't just the emotional toll that was breaking her. The physical confrontation between Jack and Alex had left its marks as well. When Jack had walked in on them together, his fury had been uncontrollable. In a fit of rage, he had lashed out at Alex, throwing punches in a blind frenzy. The violence was shocking. Emily had never imagined that their broken marriage would lead to something so physical, so destructive.